All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Our guest today is Nick Troiano. He's the executive director of Unite America and the author of a new book, The Primaries Solution Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. Nick Troiano, welcome back to the news.
Great to be back with you, Matt.
You have an amazing, statistic in your book that just 8% of voters elect 83% of the House of Representatives. So, like, whether you're mad at AOC or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or whoever, these are national figures, but they were elected by just maybe a few thousand people, right? Just a sliver of the population. It's really amazing.
Yeah, and that is, in essence, what I refer to in the book as the primary problem. The reason why so few Americans wind up electing so many of our elected officials in DC and in the state legislatures is that most of our elections are actually decided in low turnout party primaries because our general elections have become so uncompetitive between the parties. And it's those low turnout primaries that ultimately decide who gets elected, is when the parties nominate sort of their standard bearers. And that's created the system of sort of minority representation that has distorted policy outcomes in Washington, and it has even put us in a spot where I think we are today, where the vicious polarization is a threat to democracy itself.
And it also creates the perception that everybody's crazy and everybody's extreme. But in fact, actually, these representatives are not representative of the electorate, much less the general population.
Right. We've given a megaphone to small factions on the far left and far right who ought to have a voice in our politics, but not a disproportionate one. But that's the system that we have today because of the design of our electoral process. So when people look at Congress and say, why can't they solve this issue or that when 70 or 80% of Americans agree, it is essentially because they're not representing the majority. They're representing a small minority that elected them in party primaries.
Right, and that gives this perception that everything's dysfunctional, we can't get anything done. It probably breeds all sorts of distrust in the system and maybe even lack of participation ultimately. And, the problem, Nick, as you point out in the book, it's not just that extreme people are more likely to get elected, and they are in primaries, but it's also that if a normal person manages to get elected, they can't act normal, right? If they're caught compromising to pass legislation, they will be primaried. And so even if you get a decent person, they're so afraid of being primaried that they can't act normal.
That's right. That's the modern sort of phenomena around primaries. It used to be a noun, meaning the process by which a party nominates its candidate. And today it's a verb. To primary someone is the process by which activists, weaponize the primary process as punishment for those that would dare stray from the party line. And of course, all sorts of special interest groups seek to use that same system for their own ends as well, driving purity on single issues. And this is not the system that reformers, intended to create a century ago when we invented party primaries. We thought they would be a tool for democratizing our politics, for actually creating more party unity. It's just that the tectonic shifts in our politics over the last 20 years has now led these primaries to be the biggest, and in my view, biggest solvable problem in our politics.
Talk about how, sorting and gerrymandering and polarization have conspired to change the incentives away from moderation and toward extremism.
Well, the reason why 83% of congressional elections are decided in primaries rather than in November general elections is because these districts have become so uncompetitive. Some of that has to do with partisan gerrymandering when the legislators manipulate district lines to protect their own party. But a lot of it has to do with our own sorting. And by that, I mean rural areas becoming much more conservative, urban areas becoming much more progressive. And we'd have to gerrymander our way out of that problem, meaning that even if we were to draw perfectly compact and contiguous districts, we would still wind up with the vast majority of congressional districts being lopsided for one party or the other. So we should get rid of gerrymandering. It's a reform our organization supports at Unite America. It is necessary to do so, but it is woefully insufficient because of this additional sorting problem. And that's why reforms to the primary are necessary, particularly reforms that advance multiple candidates from the primary to the general elections, so that general elections are no longer 1D versus 1R, but actually multiple candidates competing against each other, which brings more competition to the general election, which means it's general election voters that ultimately decide who represents them.
Help us understand a little bit more of how we got here. I mean, as you noted, primaries have been around for a long time. Once upon a time, we had like smoke-filled back rooms, but it's become more and more democratized. But it used to be that primary voters were trying to nominate the most electable person to win the general election. And it used to be that politicians, once they got elected, were probably more worried about the other party beating them in a general election than they were about their own party beating them in a primary. How did that change to the point now where if you're a member of Congress, your big fear is probably not that the other party is going to defeat you in November, it's that someone's going to primary you.
Yeah.
How did we get to that point?
Well, we certainly didn't start here, meaning the founders themselves didn't prescribe the current system that we have today. They didn't contemplate party primaries in part because they feared parties to begin with. But it wasn't too long after the founding that parties emerged on the scene, and they were then had to figure out, well, how do we pick one candidate to represent our party in this election contest? And they started out with this sort of caucus and convention system, what you described as those proverbial smoke-filled rooms where party bosses would sort of handpick the candidates that would represent the party. That quickly became intertwined with a lot of corruption in politics because they would wind up choosing candidates who would then use the sort of government spoils to benefit the party and hand out jobs to party loyalists, etc. So that's when reformers came along at the turn of the 20th century to say, no, enough of that. We should give the voters direct say in who should nominate the party candidates. And that's when we started direct primaries. At 1904 was the first statewide primary in Wisconsin. And like I said, that was a well-intentioned reform to bring more people in the process to actually get candidates representing the parties who are going to be more competitive in the general election. It worked well for a while until we've seen some of the shifts that we have today, where no longer is it the primary is mostly a tool for nominating. It is a tool used to, keep party officials in line with their base. And when we talk about reforming the process, it's really building on a proud tradition we have as a country to innovate and experiment with new and better ways to do democracy. That's been the story since our founding. So accepting the status quo would actually be a departure from history rather than continuing to try to improve the system for our own times.
No, I mean, you raise a valid point. I mean, someone who is a conservative, I would have been typically reluctant or hesitant to embrace any sort of reform because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But it's now broken. It's clear in the Trump era that it is broken. And as you note, Nick, there's nothing sacrosanct about primaries. There's nothing in the Constitution about political parties, much less primary elections. Nobody says that we have to have a first past the post, two parties primary, all this stuff that we sort of assume was handed down from on high, that we're trying to maybe some people still want to conserve. There's really no reason that it has to be this way, right?
That's right. And a lot of what we see today is inconsistent with a lot of the principles from our founding, right? When our founding fathers warned about the mischief of factions, for example, and how it would have a detrimental impact on governance or even open the door to foreign influence and corruption. We are experiencing the worst fears of our founders today, but fortunately, they gave us the tools to fix it. It's the Constitution that says every state gets to determine the time, place, and manner of their elections, and that is what makes reform possible, because even without a constitutional amendment or act of Congress, there are solutions to this primary problem on a state-by-state basis, and that's what we're all about trying to advance.
One interesting thing you said in the book when you talked about going from like the convention system, let's say, to the primary system, is we're not going from elites to normal people. we're going from one group of elites to a different group of elites. Talk about
Yeah,
that.
that's right. I mean, the old elites used to be the party bosses. I describe the new elites as being the party bases. It is not a representative slice of the electorate that is engaged in candidate selection through the modern primary. It is a group of hyperactive party activists, largely oftentimes stuck in their own media echo chambers, that are making these decisions and influenced by a cadre of special interest groups that have developed a profit model of keeping people, divided and afraid of the other side. I mean, that is the element of our politics that is often today responsible for choosing who gets to run from each party. And like I said, that is not representative of the electorate as a whole. And in part, that's because a lot of primary rules in most states actually, by law, keep out a lot of people from participating, not just members from other parties, but people who are unaffiliated with either party, including, millions of independents, more than 23 million this year, who actually foot the bill for paying for these primaries. So, we're talking about a publicly funded, publicly administered process that is not open to all voters, and that seems awfully un-American to me.
I guess I should ask, what exactly is it you would do? How would,
Well,
how would you change the primary system if you had a magic wand?
yes, and I do spend a good chunk of the book, called The Primary Solution, on solutions. This problem is fixable, and the solution is based on two principles I write about. The first is that every voter should have the right to vote for any candidate, regardless of party, in every election. And the second principle is that whoever wins these elections ought to have majority support. So what does that look like in practice? It looks like replacing the bifurcated system of party primaries, your Democratic primary and Republican primary, with a single nonpartisan all-candidate primary. So you have one ballot that all voters get, and all the candidates listed on that ballot with their party labels. Voters can then select their favorite, and the top finishers go to the general election. And in the general election, whoever earns majority of support wins. That's the foundation for primary reform that I advocate in the book. I lay out there are several models of this that states have experimented with. You have the so-called top two nonpartisan primary that states like Nebraska, Louisiana, California, and Washington have used. And you have a top four model that Alaska was the first state to adopt in 2020, which we sort of elevate as our North Star, the best model that exists today. I'm sure we can get into detail on that. So there's a range of ways to execute those principles, but the essence of it is that we were replacing party primaries with nonpartisan primaries.
So, right now, if those of us who care about preserving liberal democracy and trying to fix the extremism and the dysfunction, there are probably numerous reforms that one could dream of. But talk, if you would, what are some of the reforms that one might want to pursue? And then why is it that the primary solution is what you call the quote biggest solvable problem? Why is this one more solvable than some of the other probably very good positive reforms would be?
Yeah. Well, I would underscore there are many problems in our politics. There are worthwhile solutions to those problems. And I take an angle of how do you prioritize them so you were focused on advancing the solutions that are not just viable, but can make a really big difference if they were to be implemented. So you have some solutions. I would consider anti-gerrymandering to be one, where it is possible, but even if you were to enact it everywhere, it wouldn't entirely solve the problem. Or you have other solutions, folks that are advocating for, say, proportional representation, for example, multi-member districts and ranked choice voting, that would be quite powerful in changing the way that we do our elections and changing incentives. But it's hard to see that happening anytime soon because it would require at least an act of Congress to get done. So on that large spectrum, I believe that primary reform stands out because this is something that can happen and has happened state by state. And when you adopt nonpartisan primaries, a couple things immediately change in our politics. The first is that every voter finally gets to have a ballot that counts, regardless of if they're Democrat, Republican, or Independent. And the second is that candidates and elected officials, their incentives change overnight because they are now forced to campaign and be responsive to a true majority of their voters if they hope to get elected and reelected. And so that's why primary reform sticks out to me as both being one of the most viable and most powerful reforms if we care about trying to deal with the problem of political polarization in our country.
And I think another externality would be just independence, right? These politicians, these leaders would be liberated to tell the truth and do what they think is right, rather than, I mean, I would say that in the Republican Party specifically, everybody's so deathly afraid of Donald Trump. And in fact, he's probably going to pick the Senate Majority Leader next. He's basically controlling the House of Representatives, or at least the Speaker of the House. So I think this would be freeing and liberating to it would bring back maybe some of the balance of power and the checks and balances that the founders intended.
Right, and we've seen that play out as well. I mean, as you're probably familiar, there were 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach former President Trump after the January 6th insurrection, and the only two of them who decided to run for re-election and survive their primary and to get reelected came from states that do not have party primaries. One came from Washington, one came from California. And it's not a coincidence. It's because this system empowers a true majority of voters to decide elections, not just the base of either party. And that's why I think primary reform is so important, not just to help advance good policymaking and break some of the gridlock, but to actually protect our democratic institutions that have come under attack by the far extremes.
Definitely. Talk if you would now. So, like, I think there are some states that would be more amenable to adopting this reform, but I'm guessing that if one part, a lot of these states are one party states, like congressional districts are obviously gerrymandered or sorted. It strikes me like the stakeholders who are in power have little incentive to change anything. So, how does that work?
Yeah. Well, we certainly see some states. I write about in the book how there's a lot that actually Oklahoma and Massachusetts share in common, and that's the fact that in 2022, all of their congressional elections were decided in primaries and not the general election. It disenfranchised a whole bunch of voters in the process. Well, those are also two good states to talk about because each have groups within them right now working on initiatives that would replace party primaries with a nonpartisan primary. And the way that they're going about that is exploring doing so through ballot initiatives. About half the states have the ballot initiative process, which allows reform to go around the state legislature and directly to the people. And when I talked about those two principles earlier on, those are principles that are supported by 70+% of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And so while the party establishment may try to prevent these ideas from getting to the ballot or make the ballot process harder itself, and we've seen that in some states, ultimately, when the people get to decide, we have seen these ideas win. It won in Alaska in 2020. It won in Nevada in 2022, where it must win a second time this year. But that's really a key pathway to achieving election reform.
And I assume you're not only should people go get the book, but are you involved sort of as an activist in helping facilitate this and lead this effort?
Yeah, to me, writing the book is not a pure academic exercise. I've had the good fortune of leading a group called Unite America. We're a national organization that's mobilizing resources to state campaigns working on these issues. And so 2024, we're quite excited because we're seeing groups in several states bring this to the ballot, as well as some groups that are working to lobby their state legislatures to advance even incremental versions of these reforms. One group called Ballot PA is active in my home state of Pennsylvania, and they are advocating for independent voters to at least be able to choose which party's primary to participate in, which is really important. There are over 1 million independent voters in Pennsylvania that cannot participate in party primaries, even though these are the voters that will ultimately decide the general election statewide, because Pennsylvania is a pretty competitive state. And those independents include a majority of young people, a majority of veterans. And so the current system is telling our future, the people who fought for the country, they don't get to have a say. That's not right. And that's what our organization is proud to support, changes to this.
I noticed in your book you're sort of hard on John Fetterman as well as Dr. Oz. Full disclosure, my book was also hard on both of them. I have to say, though, in recent months, I've been very surprised and impressed by John Fetterman. Do you share that surprise? And you know, I'm just amazed at the change I've seen in him.
Yeah, no, I think there has been an evolution on that front, and it's been interesting to watch him exercise some independence. And I think that's what makes this topic pretty interesting because there are leaders that behave in ways that might not always conform to the archetype that you might have in your mind. But certainly, as a whole, the incentives of our election process are pretty predictive of congressional behavior, and that's why last year was the least productive Congress that we've really ever have seen. And so there are individual examples maybe where some folks declare or have some independence, but on the whole, especially as we see these retirements happen and the folks that are going to replace people who've been there for a while, things are not trending in a positive direction.
This has gone very fast because I think this is efficient. We've covered more ground than I normally get to, and you're a very concise speaker. But what have I missed? What have I forgotten? What should people know that's in the book that I didn't get to?
Well, I think there are real interesting stories that I was fortunate to learn about while writing the book about how some states have achieved this reform. I think about in Maine, for example, there was an effort within the legislature, a Democrat and Republican coming together to say independent voters in our state ought to have a say. That bill passed in 2021, and it took effect this year. So this is the first year where over 300,000 independent voters are going to be able to access the ballot. Coming up shortly, we will see the primary play out in California. California now has a top two primary. That reform was a product of a few leaders in California over a decade ago who advocated for it. It was a state legislator, Abel Maldonado, who negotiated his vote on the budget for the legislature to refer this reform to the ballot, and Governor Schwarzenegger threw his support behind it. They wound up passing it. So it's not only through the ballot initiative process, but also through courageous leaders in both parties who understand that the system isn't working out too well for them either and would like to see some change. And I read about why it's in the party's interest. I mean, we see Democrats and Republicans nominating candidates far to the extremes that are less competitive in general elections and therefore losing those races. So I think I make the case that not only is the current system bad for voters in the country, it's also bad for the parties themselves. And those are just a few of the other topics that I get into.
Excellent. Well, the book's called The Primary Solution. Go get it. How can people keep in touch with you? How can they join this cause? Anything else you'd like to plug?
Sure. Like I said, 2024 is going to be a big year for this reform. Upwards of 6, 7, 8 states are going to be pursuing big campaigns for primary reform, ranked choice voting, redistricting reform. And there are groups out there working on it. So you can check out uniteamerica.org, where we have many of those groups listed, but also look into groups like Represent Us and Open Primaries and Fair Vote. There is a growing cross-partisan movement, not focused on who we elect, but on how we elect. And that's a movement that any listener can be involved in. We're also seeing, I think, the impact of what these reforms have had in Alaska in particular. They were used for the first time in 2022. And Alaskans wound up statewide electing a moderate Democrat for House, a moderate Republican for Senate, and a pretty conservative governor got reelected. And that just underscores this reform really is not about advantaging one side or another. It really is about empowering a true majority of voters to decide who gets to represent them. As a result of the success it's had for empowering voters, there have been some elements of the political establishment looking to repeal this system. And so Alaska may actually have this reform on the ballot again, where voters are going to be asked whether to keep it or not. And I expect them to say that they will, because why would they want to go back to a system in which not everyone's vote actually matters? It's much harder to take that away from voters once they've been given that opportunity. So that's just one more important campaign that will be playing out this year.
And Senator Lisa Murkowski, I believe, stood up to Trump. I believe she voted to convict in the impeachment trial. One wonders if you didn't have this system in Alaska, would she have felt liberated to make that vote? I don't know. Maybe because she did win previously, I think, by a write-in campaign. So she does have some independence, but still,
I don't think it would
I
have maybe changed the way she would have voted, but I'm not sure that Senator Murkowski, would be in the Congress again today, but for a system that empowered a majority of voters to reelect her. She obviously won by write-in in 2010, and that was an impressive feat. But it also underscores Alaska is unique in that way, and as is Connecticut, where Senator Lieberman did the same thing maybe 20 years ago, as when he got primary out of the Democratic Party. They don't have what 47 other states have in these so-called sore loser laws, where if you lose your primary, you can't reappear on the general election ballot. It's just one more way the political duopoly has sort of conspired to limit voter choice. And so that wouldn't have been the case in any other state. Yet again, one more reason we should look at reforming these primaries, because there's been so many instances that showed someone who can't win a primary would actually be quite popular among a majority of voters. And when I think about some of the impacts that this reform can have, it's not just on liberating the leaders who are in Congress. It's about creating pathways for new leaders who might not otherwise run, but for seeing an opportunity under this new system. And I think that impacts a lot of talented Americans who look at Congress today, look at the party primary system and say, no, thanks. I don't see a pathway of service. But my hope is as more states adopt this reform, great leaders will step forward to run and win and serve.
That's a very good point, because I think there's sort of a selection bias thing right now. The types of people who think they're going to run and who even try to run. So this changes all that. Go get the book. First Step, The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. I'm not an expert on these reforms, but I have to tell you, this sounds great to me. So I'm tentatively with you on board. This sounds very positive. Get the book. Nick Troiano, always a pleasure. Thank you for coming back on the news.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
All right.